Stay away from abandoned construction sites in the woods. Submitted by Probsnotashil. It was a nice day to be lost in the woods. Birds were singing in the trees, and rays of sunlight broke through the canopy overhead. Unfortunately, after hours of wandering, I still had no idea where my campsite was. I was relieved when I stumbled across the rusted chain-link fence. It was the first man-made object I had seen since heading out from camp that morning. The coiled barbed wire which lined the top of the fence wasn't exactly inviting, but at that point, I was just happy to see something aside from trees, rocks and dirt. By following the fence, I eventually found a gate with a dirt road leading up to it. To my surprise, the gate hung open. At the time, with the sun setting and my breath turning into puffs of fog, I had a tough choice. I could risk the consequences of trespassing on private property, or follow the road and hope it brought me to civilization before I succumbed to exposure. The thick padlock which hung open off one side of the gate didn't show any signs of rusting, suggesting that someone had been in the area recently. I decided it would be easier to convince a person not to call the cops on me than it would be to convince nature not to freeze me to death. Through the gate, I only had to follow a short path through the dense foliage before I entered a wide clearing dotted with buildings. One large structure sat at the far end of the space, with 8 smaller ones lining the left side. In the center, there was a hole filled with the foundations for a construction project. I reasoned that 7 of the smaller units were houses for employees who lived and worked here and that the larger structure was a mess hall. This would explain how they were able to build something so far out in the woods. The smaller building closest to me looked like a kind of makeshift office. The whole scene was eerily still and silent. I figured that if there were people around, I should be able to hear voices. I didn't like the idea of breaking into one of the small domiciles and staying the night, even if the site was empty. However, I knew I was in no position to be choosy now that it was almost completely dark, and an oppressive chill was filling the air. I decided to check the office building first, hoping that a lone employee had been left behind and was now studiously and quietly filing paperwork inside the windowless box. I pressed my ear against the door, hoping for a sign of activity inside. After hearing nothing and receiving no response to a loud knock, I decided to enter anyway. A thick padlock held the door shut, but luckily someone had left the key inside. When I opened the door, the first thing I was met with was a pungent stench. I gagged and turned around, retching into the earth at my feet. After the initial shock wore off, I turned back and held my shirt over my nose, as if that would do anything to dilute the disgusting odor. It was too dark inside the building for me to see in properly, so I had to shine a small torch in to see what was producing the smell. 4 corpses were lying inside the office. 2 were in a heap on the floor in the far corner, 1 was slumped forward in an office chair, and the last was lying in the fetal position up against a wall next to the door. I fell backwards, dropping the flashlight. It illuminated the inside of the door, which I saw was lined with heavy scratch marks. These men had been trapped inside the tiny building, and it had become their tomb. I gagged again, this time losing the contents of my stomach. Scrambling to my feet, I turned around and ran back towards the path to escape my grisly discovery. When I reached the path to leave, I stopped. I knew that if I stayed outside that night, exposed to the elements, I would probably end up just as dead as the men in the office. Faced with an impossible choice, I turned around and headed towards the mess hall. On the way over, I shone my flashlight inside the large hole which had been dug for the foundations of the build. I noticed that in the center of the hole there was a pile of earth heaped next to a deep indentation, as if some large object had been unearthed. The door to the mess hall had been left ajar. When I got close enough, I recognized the same stench which had been coming from the office, so I braced myself for the worst. The scene I found when I flicked the light switch next to the door was almost beyond rational comprehension. There were bodies all over the room. Whereas the ones in the office didn't appear to have any wounds, these were barely even recognizable as human. Each corpse had a deep gash carved through the left side of their chest, as if their hearts had been ripped out. There was also a different, strange-looking symbol carved into each person's exposed stomach. The eyes, noses and ears had been removed from each of the heads, leaving behind a surreal, bloody pulp. On the back wall of the building the words, "Bless U.S. Lord Jagulanak," were scrawled in blood. The corpses were lying as if they had been standing in a circle in the center of the room. In the middle of the circle lay the final body, strewn over a large wooden chest which was covered with dirt. This body looked the same as the others, with the only difference being that there was an iron crown on top of its head. Next to the chest, a tattered book lay on the ground. After seeing the book, I felt compelled to approach, as if some foreign force was drawing me towards it. Originally, the runes which were etched into the pages meant nothing to me. After staring at them for a while, though, I somehow started to understand. It was as if the words were being translated for me. I don't remember what was written on the page. I was found 3 days later, babbling by the side of the road. I think the people who found me assumed I was a drug addict, because they called the police instead of an ambulance. After I woke up, the cops told me I wouldn't stop talking about a monster with no head and gaping mouths full of jagged teeth on its hands. Ever since that night, I've been haunted by the same hideous nightmare. I'm standing in front of an old stone wall in a dark, unbearably hot cave. Voices whisper in my ears constantly, promising me eternal life and endless pleasures. All I have to do to earn these things, and everything else I've never wanted, is to say the name of Lord Ygolanak out loud.